On the 7th day of June in 1944, positioned in the vicinity of Sainte-Mère-Église within the Normandy region, a German soldier named Klaus Müller held the rank of Obergefreiter in the 709th Infantry Division. What he witnessed that particular morning would fundamentally challenge everything he and his fellow soldiers understood about modern warfare. As he maintained his observation post, Müller documented the passage of American military vehicles advancing from Utah Beach toward the interior of France. During a period of merely 2 hours, this German soldier tallied an astonishing 117 reconnaissance vehicles, each appearing virtually identical to the last, and all seemingly fresh from manufacturing facilities. The scene unfolding before Müller's eyes represented far more than a conventional military invasion. What he observed constituted an industrial marvel that would systematically dismantle every calculation and assumption that Wehrmacht strategists had formulated regarding the nature of armed conflict. The vehicles that American forces designated as jeeps had traversed the Atlantic Ocean in quantities numbering in the thousands. Their presence in such overwhelming numbers communicated a reality more destructive to German morale than any conventional bombardment could achieve. The truth became inescapable. Germany found itself engaged in combat not merely against another nation's armed forces, but against an entire industrial infrastructure that had successfully converted warfare into a process of mass manufacturing. The arrival of these vehicles commenced simultaneously with the initial assault waves hitting the beaches. American forces drove them directly from the ramps of landing ship tanks, vessels that had crossed the English Channel in what seemed like never-ending processions. The capacity of each individual LST allowed for the transportation of as many as 30 jeeps in fully assembled condition, and hundreds upon hundreds of these ships were actively engaged in delivering their mechanical cargo onto the Norman coastline. Each vehicle displayed identification markings indicating manufacture by either the Willys Overland Motor Company, headquartered in Toledo, Ohio, or the Ford Motor Company, based in Dearborn, Michigan. Their official military designation read as follows: Truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4, Command Reconnaissance. However, to the German soldiers who stood watching this mechanized flood pouring onto French territory, these vehicles embodied something considerably more threatening. They served as tangible proof of an industrial capability that surpassed rational comprehension. Werner Lindemann, who commanded the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment with the rank of Hauptmann, documented his observations in an after-action report that bore the date of June 9, 1944. In this report, Lindemann noted that the enemy forces possessed vehicles in such abundance that German forces typically reserved such quantities for ammunition rounds rather than complex machinery. He observed that every American military unit, extending down to the individual squad level, appeared to maintain motorized transportation capabilities. His company had successfully destroyed 12 of these reconnaissance vehicles on the previous day. Yet when morning arrived, Lindemann counted 40 such vehicles operating within the identical sector. The Americans, he concluded, treated sophisticated military vehicles with the same casual attitude that German forces reserved for rifle cartridges, utilizing them and discarding them without apparent concern for their loss. Had German military planners possessed access to the actual statistics regarding American Jeep production, the numbers would have rendered them speechless with astonishment. Throughout the period spanning from 1941 through 1945, manufacturing facilities in the United States produced in excess of 640,000 Jeeps. During the peak of production operations, the combined output of Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company resulted in the completion of one vehicle every 90 seconds as they rolled off the assembly lines. This single vehicle model represented fully 1/4 of the entire American military motor transport production effort. The Germans, who had managed to manufacture barely 50,000 Kübelwagens during the war's entire duration, simply could not conceive of production numbers of such magnitude. The foundation that made this production miracle achievable rested upon a degree of standardization that exceeded anything present within German military experience. Every Jeep, regardless of whether Willys or Ford had constructed it, utilized components that were completely interchangeable across all units. A transmission salvaged from a destroyed Ford GPW model could be installed into a Willys MB model within minutes. Wheels, engines, axles, and even the smallest components such as spark plugs and fan belts maintained identical specifications across every single production run. This standardization philosophy extended throughout the entire supply system, where spare parts were positioned in advance based upon statistical analysis of component failure rates, thereby ensuring that replacement parts remained perpetually available whenever needed. Hans Richter, a Feldwebel serving with the 716th Static Infantry Division, maintained observations of American operations from a position of concealment near Carentan. In his personal diary, Richter recorded that the Americans demonstrated no interest in repairing their vehicles in the traditional sense. Instead, they simply exchanged broken components with new ones drawn from what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply. He had personally witnessed a damaged vehicle returned to full operational status in less than 60 minutes. The engine had not undergone repair through traditional mechanical methods. Rather, the entire engine was replaced wholesale, being unbolted and lifted clear of the vehicle, with a fresh engine being installed with no more difficulty than changing a tyre. Richter noted that German mechanics would require a full week to accomplish such an operation, yet the Americans completed the task in an open field while under sporadic artillery fire, and all while smoking cigarettes as though engaged in routine maintenance. The German military mindset, shaped by traditions that emphasized preserving and maintaining every piece of equipment with meticulous care, found itself utterly unable to comprehend the American methodology. Within the Wehrmacht's operational framework, a vehicle received assignment to a specific unit and remained carefully tracked throughout its entire service existence. The loss of a vehicle through negligence constituted grounds for court-martial proceedings. When mechanical problems arose, they received diagnosis with precision and exactitude. Components were carefully repaired whenever possible, or manufactured locally when replacement parts proved unavailable. The Kubelwagen, which represented Germany's closest equivalent to the American Jeep, required mechanics with factory training for any maintenance operation of significance. The American forces operated according to entirely different fundamental principles. Their planners had calculated that the average combat life expectancy of a Jeep measured 90 days, and they had planned their logistics accordingly. Rather than investing resources in elaborate repair facilities and complex maintenance infrastructures, they simply manufactured replacement vehicles in quantities that exceeded any conceivable loss rate that combat could inflict. When a Jeep sustained damage beyond the point of immediate field repair, it was stripped of any components that remained functional and then abandoned. A replacement vehicle would arrive within hours, or at most within days, delivered by the endless convoys that maintained connection between the beach landing areas and the continuously advancing front lines. Otto von Schröder, who served as Lieutenant Colonel and Chief of Staff for the 352nd Infantry Division, captured the essence of German bewilderment in a letter he composed to his wife. He wrote that the Americans conducted what could only be described as a rich man's war. They expended vehicles with the same casual attitude that German forces reserved for ammunition expenditure. The previous day, von Schröder had observed a Jeep strike an anti-personnel mine. The crew emerged from the incident without injuries, transferred their equipment to another vehicle that materialized within minutes, and proceeded to continue their assigned mission. The destroyed Jeep was pushed to the roadside and subsequently forgotten. In the German army, such a loss would necessitate extensive reports, official investigations, and weeks of bureaucratic effort to secure a replacement vehicle. By the 10th of June, American forces had successfully landed more than 12,000 vehicles across the Normandy beaches, with Jeeps comprising the single largest category among these vehicles. These machines transformed the battlefield in ways that German military doctrine had failed to anticipate. American reconnaissance units penetrated German defensive lines with speed and flexibility that had no precedent in previous campaigns. Artillery forward observers, travelling in jeeps, could rapidly relocate their positions, rendering counter-battery fire nearly impossible to execute effectively. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing combat forces, eliminating the operational pauses for consolidation that German commanders had expected to exploit for counterattacks. The jeep's technical capabilities served to compound the difficulties facing German forces. With its four-wheel drive system and relatively low weight, this vehicle could traverse terrain that German planners had categorized as impassable for motorized vehicles. The Norman Bocage countryside, characterized by its sunken roads and dense hedgerows, should have channeled American vehicles into carefully prepared kill zones. Instead, jeeps simply drove through open fields, over embankments, and around obstacles without hesitation. They created their own improvised road networks, operating independently of the mapped routes that German forces had prepared to defend. Hans von Luck, an Oberst commanding a battle group within the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the jeep provided every American unit with the mobility that German forces had achieved only with their most elite mechanized formations. A single vehicle possessed the capability to transport a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies with equal facility. They appeared in every location, including places that German commanders had considered secure, bringing firepower or summoning artillery support through their radio equipment. German forces found themselves unable to establish a continuous defensive front because American units simply drove around established positions rather than engaging them directly. The maintenance and supply system supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming in its scope and effectiveness. American logistics units had prepared for operations on an industrial scale that defied conventional military planning. Ships arrived on a daily basis carrying not merely fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles, spare engines, transmissions, and pre-packaged component sets designed for rapid replacement. Mobile workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, possessing the capability to perform any repair or replacement operation. If a unit sustained the loss of 10 jeeps in combat, 10 replacement vehicles would arrive within 48 hours, frequently in less time. Heinrich Zimmermann, a major serving with the 12th SS Panzer Division, observed that the American supply system functioned like a factory production line that had been extended directly to the battlefield. Everything underwent standardization, received packaging, and arrived on schedule. The Americans, in Zimmermann's assessment, had successfully removed from warfare the friction that Clausewitz had described as inherent to military operations. While German forces struggled continuously to maintain their existing equipment in operational condition, the Americans simply ordered replacements as though selecting items from a commercial catalogue. The psychological impact upon German forces became evident within days following the invasion's commencement. Soldiers who had received instruction that Americans were soft and excessively dependent on material comfort discovered an enemy who possessed material abundance beyond anything they had imagined possible. The sight of endless columns comprising identical jeeps, each one appearing new and fully equipped, demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in continuous service since the Polish campaign of 1939. Wolfgang Braun, a Gefreiter serving as a mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division, examined captured jeeps and submitted a technical report. He noted that every component had been designed with mass production and easy replacement as primary considerations. The engine was simple in design, but adequate for its purpose. The transmission demonstrated robustness rather than mechanical refinement. Nothing received polishing or precise fitting in the traditional sense, yet everything functioned with reliable consistency. The Americans, Braun concluded, had sacrificed elegance for quantity, and quantity was proving victorious in this war. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers who had received indoctrination in Nazi ideology. African-American soldiers drove jeeps, performed maintenance upon them, and supervised motor pool operations. This observable reality challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions regarding racial hierarchy and military effectiveness. Kurt Wagner, a Feldwebel, noted with evident bewilderment that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with efficiency identical to that demonstrated by white soldiers. Their racial theories suggested this should prove impossible, yet the evidence before their eyes remained undeniable. American modifications to their jeeps demonstrated a flexibility that German military culture could not readily accommodate. Within days following the landing operations, various units were welding additional armor plating onto vehicles, installing wire cutters designed to counter German piano wire traps strung across roads, mounting multiple machine guns for enhanced firepower, and adapting vehicles for specialized roles that had not been originally anticipated. Medical units converted jeeps into ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment for mobile communications. Engineers mounted mine detection equipment. Each modification was crude when evaluated by German engineering standards, but immediately effective in practical application. The contrast with German equipment became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed through subsequent weeks. The Wehrmacht's vehicles required specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts, and mechanics with specific training. Many German units continued to rely upon horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder on a daily basis. The horses proved vulnerable to artillery fire, required constant care and feeding, and limited mobility to walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance produced profound demoralization among German troops. By the 15th of June, German intelligence services estimated that American forces operating in Normandy possessed in excess of 4,000 jeeps, with hundreds more arriving on a daily basis. This number seemed impossible to officers who retained memories of the entire German army invading Poland, with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types combined. The mathematics of American production suggested that the United States could sustain the loss of every vehicle currently in Normandy and replace them all within a 2-week period. Ernst Wagner, a colonel serving with the Panzer Lehr Division, compiled a comprehensive report that reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury in an air attack. Wagner wrote that German forces faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree they had never imagined achievable. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles employing the identical methods they utilized to produce civilian automobiles. Every American soldier seemed to possess knowledge of how to drive and perform basic maintenance operations. Their entire society had achieved mobilization for mechanical warfare in a manner that Germany had never accomplished. The disparity in production philosophy proved unbridgeable through any tactical or operational means. German vehicles such as the Kübelwagen were well engineered, carefully constructed, and designed with longevity as a primary consideration. However, Germany could produce only a few dozen per day, even at peak production capacity. American jeeps were simple, crude by German engineering standards, but rolled off assembly lines at rates Germany could not match even if all its factories operated in perfect coordination. Where German industry pursued perfection in individual vehicles, American industry pursued adequacy multiplied by overwhelming numerical superiority. Fritz Bayerlein, a general major commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, provided a stark assessment of the situation. He stated that German forces were fighting the previous war while the Americans fought the next one. Germans perfected individual vehicles while Americans perfected the system that produced vehicles in mass quantities. Germans trained specialist mechanics while Americans designed vehicles that any soldier could maintain. They were artisans confronting an assembly line, and the assembly line was winning this contest decisively. The redundancy built into the American system frustrated every attempt at German tactical planning. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineer units appeared almost immediately with portable bridging equipment carried on jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared within hours. Mining roads only caused Americans to drive through open fields. Every German tactical success was negated by American material abundance that rendered conventional attrition warfare meaningless. The Jeep became a symbol of this abundance that transcended its purely military function. German soldiers filed reports describing Jeeps being used for tasks that would have been completely unthinkable within the Wehrmacht's operational framework. They observed Jeeps delivering mail, transporting journalists to frontline positions, carrying chaplains to forward positions for religious services, and even moving generals' personal baggage. This casual utilization of military equipment for convenience rather than absolute necessity demonstrated a wealth that German soldiers, accustomed to scarcity and careful preservation of every resource, found simultaneously amazing and demoralizing. Friedrich Hoffmann, a lieutenant, wrote to his family describing his observations. He noted that the Americans used their vehicles in the manner that German forces used bicycles, for everything and without concern for wear and tear. He had personally observed a Jeep being utilized to deliver hot food to a single isolated outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel purely for the comfort of 3 men. In the German army, those 3 men would walk to their destination and consume cold rations. This apparent wastefulness should constitute a military weakness, but when one possessed the ability to waste without consequence, it transformed into a form of strength. The technological gap manifested in unexpected ways throughout operations. American Jeeps arrived fully equipped with standardized toolkits, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper, and spare parts packages calculated through statistical analysis. German vehicles often lacked even basic tools, relied upon mechanics' accumulated experience rather than documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex requisition system that could require weeks to fulfill even simple requests. As June progressed into July, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility on any operational level. Static defensive positions could be bypassed. Mobile counterattacks arrived too slowly. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that favored the side possessing unlimited motorized transport capabilities. Wilhelm von Stülpnagel, a major observing American breakout preparations in late July, wrote that the Americans had achieved something German planners had considered impossible: the complete motorization of an entire army. Every soldier could be moved by vehicle. Every artillery piece could be towed at highway speeds. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the end consumer. German forces were fighting a 19th-century war against an enemy employing 20th-century methods. The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved futile at every turn. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were everywhere simultaneously. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany had not seen since 1940. By the time of Operation Cobra in late July, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with Jeeps comprising the single largest category. The German estimate, compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance, suggested the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and remain more highly motorized than any German division at full strength. This calculation, when reported to Berlin, was dismissed as defeatist thinking. It was actually conservative in its assessment. The influence of American motorization extended beyond immediate military impact. German officers who survived the war would carry these lessons into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and designed simplicity would influence German industrial development in profound ways. The Volkswagen, which had failed as the Kübelwagen to compete with the Jeep in wartime, would succeed as the Beetle in peacetime, applying mass production principles the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly. Otto Schultz, a Feldwebel who spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in America, later reflected upon his experiences. In Normandy, he realized that modern war was not fundamentally about courage or individual skill, but about industrial capacity. The Americans showed German forces that victory belonged to whoever could produce the most, ship the fastest, and replace losses immediately. The Jeep was not merely a vehicle, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare that German forces were not prepared to fight. The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents more than a simple military mismatch or technological disparity. It constituted a collision between two different civilizations' fundamental approaches to warfare. The Germans, with their deep tradition of professional military excellence and carefully maintained equipment, met an American military that had successfully transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production. In the final analysis, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across Normandy represented something more profound than military vehicles serving their intended purpose. They were the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy, tangible proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations completely obsolete. For German soldiers watching those columns advance day after day, each individual jeep served as a messenger bearing the same simple truth. The age of artisan warfare had ended, and the age of industrial warfare had begun. The final words on this subject belong to Ernst Bergmann, a Hauptmann who observed American operations throughout the entire Normandy campaign and survived to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. The Americans, Bergmann concluded, taught German forces that in modern warfare, the factory is more important than the battlefield itself. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers with each one identical and replaceable, showed that warfare had become a branch of industry. German soldiers thought they were professional warriors. The Americans showed them they were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and the American factory of destruction was infinitely larger and more efficient than anything Germany could produce. The lessons learned in Normandy regarding industrial capacity, standardization, and mass production would reshape not only military thinking, but also civilian industry in the post-war era. The Jeep stood as a testament to what could be achieved when an entire nation's industrial base mobilized for a single purpose. It demonstrated that wars in the modern age would be won not by the side with the most skilled soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the side capable of producing, shipping, and replacing materiel faster than the enemy could destroy it. For the German soldiers who witnessed this industrial miracle firsthand, the experience proved transformative. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of German engineering, the value of precision manufacturing, and the importance of carefully preserving resources. They learned that in total war, simplicity multiplied by massive-scale defeats complexity every time. They discovered that a crude vehicle produced by the millions outperforms a sophisticated vehicle produced by the thousands. They realized that the ability to replace losses immediately matters more than the ability to prevent losses through superior design. These realizations came at a terrible cost. Every German position that was bypassed by Jeep-borne American forces, every supply line that was interdicted, every reconnaissance patrol that was outpaced, and every defensive line that collapsed under the weight of motorized assault drove home the same inescapable conclusion. Germany had prepared to fight a war of maneuver and tactical brilliance. America had prepared to fight a war of industrial output and logistical supremacy. In the hedgerows and fields of Normandy, industrial supremacy proved decisive. The Jeep itself, that simple quarter-ton truck with four-wheel drive, became in German eyes a symbol of everything they were fighting against and everything they could not match. It represented American pragmatism over German perfectionism, American abundance over German scarcity, American flexibility over German rigidity, and American industrial power over German military tradition. Every time a German soldier saw another Jeep, fresh from the factory and driven by a crew who treated it as disposable, he was confronted with the reality that his nation was losing a contest it had never properly understood it was fighting. The contrast between German and American approaches to military logistics became even more apparent as the campaign continued through the summer months. German units that had been in continuous combat since the initial invasion found their vehicle strength declining steadily through attrition. A panzer division that had begun the campaign with perhaps 200 operational vehicles might find itself reduced to 50 or 60 within weeks. Replacement vehicles were promised but rarely arrived. The industrial capacity simply did not exist to make good the losses. Meanwhile, American units maintained their vehicle strength at near 100% through the simple expedient of continuous replacement. Vehicles damaged beyond economical repair were abandoned. New vehicles arrived to replace them. The American system treated vehicles as consumables. This fundamental difference in logistics philosophy extended to every aspect of military operations. When a German vehicle broke down, mechanics were summoned to diagnose and repair the problem. Scarce parts were requisitioned through proper channels. The vehicle remained out of action for days or weeks. When an American vehicle broke down, a replacement vehicle was summoned. The broken vehicle was either repaired quickly using pre-positioned spare parts, or it was stripped and abandoned. The American unit's operational capability remained unaffected. Time after time, German officers observed American units maintaining operational tempo despite heavy vehicle losses that would have paralyzed a German formation. The standardization that made this system possible extended beyond the vehicles themselves. American fuel was standardized. German forces used different fuel grades for different vehicles, creating complex supply chain requirements. American ammunition was standardized. American rations were standardized. American uniforms were standardized. Every element of American logistics reflected the same philosophy. Create standard items, produce them in massive quantities, distribute them efficiently, and replace them without hesitation. German soldiers who captured American supply dumps reported findings that seemed almost impossible. Cases of spare parts, each containing identical components. Drums of fuel, all the same grade. Boxes of ammunition, all the same caliber. Everything organized, everything labeled, everything abundant. German supply dumps, by contrast, contained whatever had managed to arrive through increasingly disrupted supply lines, parts that might fit some vehicles but not others. Fuel of varying grades depending on source. Ammunition of different types depending on what could be scrounged. The efficiency of American supply operations demoralized German troops who had been taught that German organizational skills were superior. American supply units used standardized forms and procedures. Requisitions were processed quickly. Items were delivered on schedule. The system worked with mechanical precision because it had been designed as a system rather than evolved through military tradition. German supply operations, despite the reputation for efficiency, relied heavily on individual initiative and improvisation. When the system worked, it worked well. When it broke down, as it increasingly did under combat pressure, there was no redundancy to compensate. The mobility that jeeps provided to American forces manifested in ways that continuously surprised German defenders. American artillery forward observers in jeeps could advance with the leading infantry, identify targets, and call for fire support within minutes. German artillery observers, often on foot or with limited transport, could not match this responsiveness. American commanders rode in jeeps, allowing them to visit subordinate units, assess situations personally, and make decisions based on direct observation rather than delayed reports. German commanders, constrained by limited transport, relied more heavily on radio communications and map assessments. The psychological impact of this mobility gap extended throughout the German command structure. Junior officers reported that American forces seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. Reconnaissance patrols that should have taken hours appeared within minutes. Supply convoys that should have been vulnerable to interdiction arrived safely through alternative routes. Reserve units that should have required hours to deploy appeared with unexpected speed. The cumulative effect was a sense that American forces operated at a different tempo, moving faster and reacting more quickly than German doctrine anticipated. This tempo differential became particularly evident during the American breakout from Normandy. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, demonstrated what American motorization could achieve when combined with tactical air power and concentrated artillery. German defensive positions that should have required weeks to reduce were bypassed in days. American armoured columns, led by jeep-mounted reconnaissance elements, penetrated deep into German rear areas. Supply lines kept pace with advancing combat units. The entire operation moved with a speed that German forces, accustomed to the methodical pace of previous campaigns, found impossible to counter. German attempts to slow the American advance by destroying bridges and blocking roads proved largely ineffective. American engineer units, equipped with bridging materials transported on trucks and jeeps, simply built new crossings. Roadblocks were bypassed by forces driving cross-country. Every obstacle created by German forces was overcome through the application of material abundance and mechanical mobility. The only effective way to stop American advances was through direct combat, and even successful tactical engagements only delayed rather than halted American progress. The maintenance philosophy that supported American motorization represented another stark contrast with German practices. American maintenance doctrine emphasized prevention through regular servicing and immediate replacement of worn components. Vehicles received scheduled maintenance regardless of whether they showed signs of problems. Parts were replaced based on operating hours rather than waiting for failure. This approach, wasteful by German standards, ensured that vehicles remained operational. German maintenance, by necessity, adopted a reactive approach. Parts were replaced when they failed, not before. Vehicles received maintenance when they broke down, not on a schedule. This saved resources in the short term, but reduced overall operational availability. The training that American soldiers received in vehicle operation and maintenance also differed fundamentally from German practice. In the American military, basic driver training and simple maintenance procedures formed part of standard soldier training. Most American soldiers could drive a jeep and perform basic maintenance tasks such as changing oil, replacing spark plugs, or adjusting tire pressure. In the German military, drivers were specialists who received extended training. Maintenance was the province of trained mechanics. This meant that American units possessed redundant capability. If a driver was killed or wounded, another soldier could take the wheel. If a vehicle needed basic service, any soldier could perform it. German units lacked this redundancy. Specialized personnel were not easily replaced. The social and cultural factors underlying American motorization also struck German observers as significant. The United States possessed, even before the war, a highly motorized civilian society. Automobiles were common. Roads were good. Most young American men had experience driving before entering military service. Germany, despite its advanced industry, remained less motorized. Automobiles were expensive. Many Germans had never driven before entering military service. This cultural difference meant that Americans adapted more naturally to mechanized warfare. The skills required were extensions of civilian experience rather than entirely new competencies. The racial integration visible in American motor transport units continued to perplex German observers indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology. African American soldiers not only drove and maintained vehicles, but did so with evident competence. This observable fact contradicted fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy and capability. German propaganda had portrayed non-white peoples as inferior and incapable of mastering modern technology. The reality of integrated American motor pools, where black soldiers performed the same tasks as white soldiers with the same effectiveness, challenged these assumptions in ways that propaganda could not counter. Some German soldiers, particularly those with education and critical thinking skills, recognized the implications of what they observed. If Nazi racial theories were wrong about this observable phenomenon, what else might they be wrong about? The cognitive dissonance created by witnessing competent African American soldiers operating complex machinery contributed to a broader erosion of confidence in Nazi ideology among thoughtful observers. The propaganda had promised that racial superiority would ensure German victory. The reality demonstrated that industrial capacity and organizational efficiency mattered more than racial composition. The adaptability that American forces demonstrated with their jeeps also impressed German observers who recognized tactical innovation when they saw it. The basic jeep design provided a platform that units modified for countless specialized purposes. Jeeps became ambulances, weapons carriers, command vehicles, reconnaissance platforms, radio stations, and personnel carriers. Each unit adapted the standard vehicle to meet specific needs. Some mounted additional armor, some installed heavier weapons, some added specialized equipment. The modifications were rarely elegant by German engineering standards, but they were effective and they were immediate. This adaptability reflected a broader American cultural tendency toward practical innovation and improvisation. German military culture emphasized adherence to established procedures and designs. Modifications required approval through formal channels. Innovation was controlled and centralized. American military culture, at least at the tactical level, encouraged local adaptation and immediate problem-solving. If a unit identified a need, they often addressed it directly rather than waiting for official solutions. This cultural difference gave American forces a flexibility that German forces struggled to match. The cumulative psychological impact of facing an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority cannot be overstated. German soldiers had been trained to believe in their qualitative superiority. German weapons were better. German tactics were superior. German soldiers were more skilled. These beliefs sustained morale through difficult campaigns. The experience of Normandy systematically destroyed these comforting assumptions. American weapons might be simpler, but there were more of them. American tactics might be less sophisticated, but they were supported by unlimited material. American soldiers might be less experienced initially, but they learned quickly, and they never lacked equipment. The endless columns of jeeps became a daily reminder of this material disparity. Every morning brought more vehicles. Every destroyed jeep was replaced. Every roadside was littered with abandoned vehicles that would have been precious in German service but were worthless to Americans who had unlimited replacements. German soldiers, raised in a culture that valued thrift and careful resource management, found this abundance both amazing and dispiriting. How could you defeat an enemy who treated vehicles like disposable items? The answer, increasingly apparent as the summer progressed, was that you could not. The campaign in Normandy demonstrated that industrial war had rules different from traditional warfare. Victory went not to the most skilled or courageous, but to the side that could sustain material output. Germany had prepared to fight a war of maneuver, speed, and tactical excellence. America had prepared to fight a war of production, logistics, and material supremacy. In Normandy, these two approaches met, and the outcome proved decisive. The side that could produce more, ship more, and replace more would inevitably prevail over the side that could not match this material effort regardless of tactical skill. This realization spread through German ranks as the campaign continued. Junior officers reported it to senior officers. Senior officers reported it to division commanders. Division commanders reported it to corps and army headquarters. Army headquarters reported it to the High Command. The High Command reported it to Hitler. At every level, the message was the same. American material superiority was overwhelming. The numbers of vehicles, the quantities of ammunition, the abundance of supplies created a military force that could not be defeated through traditional military operations. Hitler's response to these reports demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of modern industrial warfare. He ordered troops to fight harder. He demanded counterattacks. He forbade retreats. He spoke of wonder weapons and secret projects that would change the course of the war. He refused to accept that the war had become a contest of industrial capacity rather than military skill, and that Germany had already lost that contest. The production figures were clear to anyone who examined them objectively. American industrial output exceeded German industrial output by factors of 5 to 10, depending on the category. This gap could not be closed through military action. It could only be addressed through industrial transformation, and Germany lacked the time, resources, and intact infrastructure to accomplish such transformation. The Jeep, in this context, became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of American industrial might projected onto European battlefields. Every Jeep represented thousands of man-hours of labor in American factories. It represented tons of steel, rubber, and other materials extracted, processed, and manufactured. It represented a supply chain stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. It represented a society that had mobilized its entire industrial base for war production. Most importantly, it represented the fact that America could produce these vehicles faster than Germany could destroy them, and could deliver them to battlefields faster than Germany could interdict supply lines. For German soldiers and officers who survived the Normandy campaign, the lessons learned about American industrial warfare would influence their thinking for the rest of their lives. Those who became prisoners of war and were sent to America witnessed firsthand the industrial infrastructure that produced the endless stream of vehicles. They saw factories larger than German towns. They saw assembly lines producing goods at rates that seemed impossible. They saw a civilian population with a standard of living that exceeded anything they had known. They understood, finally, that Germany had never possessed the industrial capacity to win a total war against America. This understanding, painful as it was, proved valuable in the post-war period. German industrial leaders who had witnessed American mass production adopted its principles in rebuilding German industry. The Volkswagen Beetle, Germany's most successful post-war product, embodied lessons learned from the Jeep. Standardization, mass production, designed simplicity, and ease of maintenance. German automotive engineers who had examined captured Jeeps during the war applied American manufacturing principles to civilian production after the war. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s owed much to lessons learned about American industrial methods, lessons taught on the battlefields of Normandy by the endless columns of identical Jeeps. The final irony was that Germany had possessed, before the war, some of the world's most advanced manufacturing capabilities. German industries produced excellent machine tools, precision instruments, and quality products. But German industry had not made the transition to true mass production that American industry had accomplished. German manufacturing emphasized craft and quality. American manufacturing emphasized standardization and quantity. In peacetime, the German approach produced superior individual products. In total war, the American approach produced victory through overwhelming material superiority. The Jeep's story in Normandy thus represents more than a tale of military logistics. It represents the triumph of one industrial philosophy over another, of mass production over craftsmanship, of quantity over quality, of standardization over variation. It demonstrates that in total war involving entire industrial economies, the nation that can produce more will ultimately defeat the nation that produces better individual items in smaller quantities. This lesson, taught across the beaches and hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944, remains relevant to understanding industrial warfare and military logistics in any era. The specific technical characteristics of the Jeep contributed significantly to its battlefield success and its impact on German observers. The vehicle's four-wheel drive system, a feature relatively uncommon in civilian vehicles of the era, provided traction in conditions where two-wheel drive vehicles became immobilized. The Norman landscape, with its clay soils that turned to mud in rain, challenged all vehicles. Yet Jeeps continued operating where German vehicles became stuck. The low ground pressure, achieved through wide tyres and light weight, allowed Jeeps to traverse soft ground without bogging down. German vehicles, often heavier and with narrower tyres, sank into mud that jeeps crossed without difficulty. The jeep's ground clearance, though modest by modern off-road standards, proved adequate for the terrain encountered in Normandy. The vehicle could ford streams, cross ditches, and climb embankments that would have stopped conventional automobiles. This capability meant that jeeps were not restricted to roads. They could operate across open country, through forests, and over rough terrain. This cross-country mobility transformed tactical planning. American units were not road-bound. They could maneuver through terrain that German planners had assumed would channel movement onto predictable routes. The simplicity of the jeep's mechanical design also contributed to its reliability and ease of maintenance. The engine, a four-cylinder unit producing modest power, was robust and tolerant of rough treatment. It lacked the sophistication of German engines, but it also lacked their complexity and fragility. The transmission was straightforward. The suspension was simple. The electrical system was basic. Every component was designed for reliability rather than performance. This design philosophy meant that jeeps continued operating under conditions that would have disabled more sophisticated vehicles. The jeep's fuel efficiency, while not remarkable by civilian standards, proved advantageous in military logistics. The vehicle consumed approximately 15 to 20 miles per gallon under normal operating conditions. This meant that a single 5-gallon jerrycan could extend the jeep's range by 75 to 100 miles. Refueling could be accomplished quickly using portable containers. The fuel tank's location made it easy to fill. The entire refueling process took minutes rather than the extended procedures required for some German vehicles with protected or hard-to-access fuel tanks. The carrying capacity of the jeep, though limited to 1/4 ton officially, proved remarkably flexible in practice. American soldiers routinely loaded jeeps well beyond rated capacity. The vehicles carried ammunition, supplies, equipment, and personnel in quantities that exceeded design specifications. The simple suspension compressed under heavy loads but rarely failed. The engine strained but continued operating. The transmission complained but kept functioning. This ability to accept overloading without catastrophic failure reflected American engineering philosophy. Design with safety margins and accept that users will exceed specifications. The jeep's role in casualty evacuation particularly impressed German medical personnel who observed American operations. Jeeps could be rapidly converted to ambulances by installing stretcher racks. A single jeep could evacuate wounded soldiers from front-line positions to aid stations within minutes. The speed of evacuation improved survival rates significantly. German wounded often waited hours for evacuation by horse-drawn ambulances or on foot. American wounded received rapid evacuation by jeep, reaching surgical facilities while still viable for treatment. This difference in casualty evacuation capability affected morale on both sides. American soldiers knew they would receive quick medical attention if wounded. German soldiers knew their evacuation might be delayed or impossible. The communication capabilities that jeeps provided to American forces represented another significant advantage. Many jeeps carried radio equipment, creating mobile command and communication posts. American commanders could coordinate operations while moving. Artillery observers could direct fire while repositioning. Infantry could request support while advancing. The radios were powered by the jeep's electrical system, eliminating the need for separate generators. This integration of mobility and communication created a responsive command structure that German forces, relying more heavily on stationary command posts and less mobile communications, could not match. The vulnerability of jeeps to enemy fire, an apparent weakness, proved less significant than German forces initially hoped. The vehicles lacked armor protection. Small arms fire could disable them easily. Artillery fragments could destroy them. Yet their speed and mobility often provided better protection than armor would have. Jeeps moved fast enough to avoid becoming easy targets. They could rapidly leave areas under fire. Their small size made them difficult to hit. Most importantly, their abundance meant that destroying individual vehicles had little strategic impact. The loss of a jeep was tactically insignificant when replacements arrived continuously. German attempts to counter American motorization through anti-vehicle tactics achieved limited success. Mining roads and likely routes destroyed some vehicles, but Americans adapted by driving cross-country or using mine detection equipment mounted on jeeps. Ambushing convoys killed crews and destroyed vehicles, but replacement convoys appeared within hours. Artillery fire on motor pools achieved temporary disruption, but vehicles dispersed widely proved difficult to target effectively. The fundamental problem was that every tactical success against American vehicles proved temporary. The endless stream of replacements negated any local gains. The fuel consumption of American motorized forces, which German planners had identified as a potential weakness, never became the vulnerability they anticipated. American logistics delivered fuel in quantities that matched consumption. Fuel dumps were established and maintained throughout the operational area. Tanker trucks and fuel delivery by jerrycan ensured continuous supply. German attempts to interdict fuel supplies through air attacks or artillery proved largely ineffective. American air superiority protected supply lines. Dispersed storage reduced vulnerability to attack. The fuel supply system, like the vehicle replacement system, operated with industrial efficiency. The training that American soldiers received in vehicle convoy operations also contributed to operational effectiveness. Drivers maintained proper spacing to minimize vulnerability to artillery. Convoys dispersed when attacked, then reformed quickly. Route discipline ensured efficient use of road networks. Vehicle marshalling before movements reduced congestion. These procedures, standardized across all units, created a smooth flow of vehicles that maximized throughput while minimizing vulnerability. German observers noted that American convoys moved with a discipline and efficiency that belied the supposedly undisciplined nature of American forces that German propaganda portrayed. The environmental impact of American motorization on the Norman landscape became visible within weeks of the invasion. Roads widened under constant traffic. Fields were rutted by cross-country movement. Hedgerows were broken where vehicles had passed. The physical landscape itself bore witness to the passage of thousands of vehicles. German soldiers, accustomed to armies that moved on foot or with limited transport, found the physical evidence of American mobility impressive and somewhat disturbing. The land itself was being reshaped by the sheer volume of vehicular traffic. The social dynamics within American units that jeeps enabled also struck German observers. American officers and enlisted men often rode together in the same vehicles. The class distinctions that characterized German military culture were less pronounced in American motor pools. Soldiers addressed officers with less formality. The shared experience of maintaining and operating vehicles created bonds across rank boundaries. This apparent lack of proper military hierarchy offended some German observers raised in a more stratified military culture. Yet the practical effect was a more flexible and adaptive organization where information flowed more freely across ranks. The role of jeeps in American reconnaissance operations deserves particular emphasis. Reconnaissance units equipped with jeeps could penetrate German lines rapidly, gather information, and withdraw before German forces could respond effectively. The speed of jeep-mounted reconnaissance made traditional cavalry reconnaissance obsolete. A jeep patrol could cover in hours what a mounted cavalry patrol would require days to accomplish. The information gathered reached headquarters quickly via radio or by physical return of the patrol. This reconnaissance capability gave American commanders current information about German positions, movements, and intentions. The use of jeeps in artillery operations transformed indirect fire support. Forward observers in jeeps accompanied advancing infantry, maintaining visual contact with enemy positions. When targets appeared, observers could immediately call for fire support. The mobility of jeep-mounted observers meant they could follow rapidly advancing units or quickly relocate when discovered. This created a dynamic artillery support system that could respond to targets of opportunity within minutes. German artillery, relying more on pre-planned fires and less mobile observation, could not match this responsiveness. The employment of jeeps in military police operations also contributed to battlefield efficiency. MP units in jeeps controlled traffic, directed movements, and maintained order on congested roads. The mobility of jeep-mounted MPs meant they could respond quickly to problems anywhere in the rear area. Accidents could be cleared, congestion could be relieved, lost units could be redirected. This traffic control capability maximized the throughput of limited road networks, ensuring that supplies and reinforcements reached forward units efficiently. The maintenance units supporting American motorization operated with industrial efficiency that German forces could not replicate. Mobile maintenance units advanced with combat forces, establishing repair facilities wherever needed. These units carried comprehensive parts inventories, specialized tools, and trained personnel. When a vehicle required repair beyond field capabilities, it was evacuated to a maintenance unit. The repair or replacement was accomplished quickly. The vehicle or its replacement returned to service. This maintenance system treated vehicle repair as an industrial process subject to standardization and efficiency measures. The psychological impact on German civilians who observed American motorization should not be overlooked. French civilians watched American convoys pass through liberated towns and villages. The sheer number of vehicles astonished people accustomed to German forces that relied heavily on horses and foot movement. French civilians understood immediately that the Americans possessed resources Germany could never match. This realization affected civilian morale and resistance activities. The Germans were clearly losing to an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The partisan and resistance forces in France also benefited from American motorization. As American forces advanced, they often provided vehicles and fuel to resistance units. Jeeps allowed resistance fighters to conduct operations over wider areas. The mobility enhanced resistance effectiveness significantly. German forces found themselves facing not only American mobile units, but also increasingly mobile resistance forces. The combination of regular American forces and motorized resistance created security problems in rear areas that German forces struggled to address with their limited resources. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity extended to seemingly minor details that cumulatively affected operations. American soldiers had access to replacement clothing, boots, and personal equipment. Worn items were replaced without hesitation. German soldiers wore the same uniforms until they fell apart. Replacement items were scarce. American soldiers could requisition tools and equipment for tasks. German soldiers improvised with whatever was available. These differences in material support affected morale, comfort, and ultimately combat effectiveness. The documentary evidence that German forces compiled regarding American motorization created an increasingly desperate picture. Intelligence summaries noted the continuous arrival of vehicles. After-action reports described the mobility of American forces. Prisoners interrogated revealed the casual attitude Americans had toward vehicle losses. Photo reconnaissance showed the extent of American motor pools. Every intelligence source confirmed the same conclusion. American material superiority was comprehensive and could not be overcome through military action alone. The response of different German commanders to American motorization varied based on their understanding and adaptability. Some commanders recognized the reality and fought defensive battles designed to inflict maximum casualties while preserving their forces. Others, following Hitler's insistence on rigid defense, fought battles of attrition they could not win. The most perceptive commanders understood that facing an enemy with unlimited material resources required different tactics than fighting an equally matched opponent. Yet even the most skilled German commanders could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources. The evolution of German tactics in response to American motorization showed both adaptation and limitation. German forces learned to target American supply columns when possible. They developed ambush tactics designed to exploit temporary vulnerabilities. They used terrain to channel American vehicles into kill zones. Yet every tactical adaptation met American counter-adaptation backed by overwhelming resources. Americans modified tactics based on experience. They deployed security more effectively. They used firepower to suppress German positions. They simply drove around obstacles. The tactical learning occurred on both sides, but only one side had unlimited material to support tactical innovation. The German soldiers' experience of fighting an enemy with superior motorization created lasting impressions that influenced post-war memoirs and histories. Veterans wrote about the endless American convoys. They described the frustration of fighting an enemy that could not be decisively defeated because every loss was immediately replaced. They explained the psychological impact of facing material abundance that seemed limitless. These first-hand accounts provide valuable insights into how industrial warfare appeared to soldiers accustomed to resource scarcity. The broader strategic implications of American motorization in Normandy extended beyond the immediate campaign. The lessons learned influenced subsequent operations in Europe. American forces continued to leverage their mobility advantage. German forces continued to struggle with inadequate motorization. The pattern established in Normandy repeated across France, into the Low Countries, and eventually into Germany itself. American motorization proved to be not just a tactical advantage, but a strategic determinant of the war's outcome in Western Europe. The comparison between American and Soviet approaches to motorization provides additional context. The Soviet Union also fielded large numbers of vehicles, many supplied through American Lend-Lease. However, Soviet motorization emphasized trucks for supply and troop transport rather than the comprehensive motorization at all tactical levels that Americans achieved. The Jeep, as a vehicle designed for tactical use rather than strategic transport, represented a distinctly American approach to military motorization. The Germans faced different challenges on the eastern and western fronts, but both involved enemies with superior motorized capability. The legacy of the Jeep extended far beyond World War II. The vehicle's design influenced post-war civilian vehicles. The concept of the light, versatile four-wheel drive vehicle became embedded in automotive culture. Military forces worldwide adopted similar vehicles. The word Jeep entered common language as a generic term for light off-road vehicles. This cultural impact reflected the vehicle's significance in demonstrating what could be achieved through mass production of a simple, effective design. For the German soldiers and officers who witnessed American motorization in Normandy, the experience proved transformative in ways that extended beyond military understanding. They saw the future of warfare. They recognized that industrial capacity would determine the outcomes of future conflicts. They understood that armies in the industrial age required not just brave soldiers and skilled commanders, but also vast industrial infrastructures capable of producing and sustaining military equipment in unprecedented quantities. These insights, painful as they were to acquire, proved valuable in the post-war period when Germany rebuilt as an industrial power in a world where military strength increasingly depended on industrial capacity. The organizational structure that enabled American motorization deserves detailed examination. The United States Army had reorganized itself specifically to exploit motorization. Units were designed around vehicle availability. Tables of organization specified vehicle allocations down to company level. Supply systems were structured to support motorized operations. Training emphasized vehicle operation and maintenance. Doctrine assumed motorized mobility. Every aspect of American military organization reflected the assumption that forces would be fully motorized. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had motorized elite units while leaving most forces dependent on foot movement and horses. This organizational difference meant that Americans could execute operations that German forces could conceptualize but not implement. The maintenance of such large numbers of vehicles required an infrastructure that Germans observed with professional interest. American motor pools were organized like civilian service stations and repair shops. Work was systematized, procedures were standardized, parts were inventoried and tracked. Mechanics specialized in particular systems. The entire operation reflected industrial management principles applied to military maintenance. German motor pools, smaller and less standardized, relied more on the skill of individual mechanics. When American approaches worked, they worked efficiently. When they encountered problems outside standard procedures, they sometimes struggled. Yet the overall efficiency of the American system far exceeded German capabilities. The environmental conditions in Normandy tested both American vehicles and German assumptions about their durability. The Norman summer of 1944 brought periods of heavy rain that turned roads to mud and fields to quagmires. German observers expected American vehicles, seemingly mass-produced without attention to quality, to fail under these conditions. Instead, jeeps continued operating. Mud-splattered vehicles kept running. Water-soaked engines continued firing. The simplicity and robustness of American design proved more valuable than German sophistication. A vehicle that kept running while covered in mud proved more useful than a vehicle that required clean conditions to operate. The use of jeeps in combined arms operations illustrated American tactical flexibility. Infantry units used jeeps to rapidly reposition machine guns and mortars. Armor units used jeeps for reconnaissance and flank security. Artillery used jeeps for forward observation and ammunition resupply. Engineers used jeeps to transport demolitions and mine-clearing equipment. Each arm of service adapted the basic vehicle to specific tactical needs. This flexibility reflected both the vehicle's versatile design and American willingness to experiment with non-standard employment. German forces, more rigid in their tactical doctrine, often failed to appreciate how this flexibility enhanced American combat effectiveness. The replacement of battlefield losses through the American supply system operated with a speed that continuously surprised German intelligence officers. A unit reporting vehicle losses would receive replacements within 24 to 48 hours under normal conditions. Even during periods of intense combat when losses were heavy, replacement vehicles arrived within days. This rapid replacement capability meant that American units maintained their mobility even during sustained operations. German units, by contrast, saw their mobility degrade steadily during prolonged campaigns as vehicle losses accumulated without adequate replacement. The psychological aspects of fighting an enemy with superior motorization affected German morale in ways that went beyond simple demoralization. German soldiers developed a sense of inevitable defeat when facing an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The knowledge that destroying an American vehicle merely delayed that particular crew for hours, rather than eliminating a scarce resource, reduced the satisfaction of tactical success. Every small German victory proved ultimately meaningless in the face of American material abundance. This psychological burden accumulated over time, eroding combat motivation and fighting spirit. The comparison between the Kübelwagen and the Jeep extended beyond simple technical specifications. The Kübelwagen, while an excellent vehicle by many measures, reflected German design priorities that emphasized efficiency and economy rather than ease of production. The vehicle featured air cooling rather than liquid cooling, reducing weight and complexity. Yet this design choice made the engine more difficult to manufacture and less amenable to mass production. The Jeep's liquid-cooled engine was heavier and more complex, but used standard automotive manufacturing techniques that enabled rapid production. This pattern repeated across both designs. German choices optimized the individual vehicle, American choices optimized the production system. The integration of Jeeps into American tactical doctrine happened rapidly during the early campaigns in North Africa, and then was refined by the time of Normandy. American commanders learned how to exploit the mobility that Jeeps provided. Reconnaissance in force became practical when reconnaissance units possessed speed and mobility. Raids deep into enemy rear areas became feasible when raiders could rapidly penetrate and withdraw. Pursuit of defeated enemies became possible when pursuing forces were fully motorized. The tactical possibilities that motorization enabled were identified, documented, and incorporated into standard operating procedures. German forces, having theorized about motorized warfare without possessing the vehicles to implement it fully, found themselves facing an enemy that had both the theory and the means. The fuel logistics supporting American motorization represented another triumph of industrial organization. Gasoline crossed the Atlantic in tankers, was pumped ashore through temporary pipelines, was stored in portable fuel dumps, was distributed by tanker trucks, and was delivered to units in jerry cans. The entire system operated with industrial precision. Fuel shortages, when they occurred, resulted from temporary logistical bottlenecks rather than absolute scarcity. German forces, perpetually short of fuel, could only envy an enemy for whom fuel logistics was a solved problem rather than a constant crisis. The impact of American motorization on the tempo of operations deserves emphasis. Motorized forces could advance faster, sustain operations longer, and exploit successes more rapidly than foot-mobile forces. The operational tempo that American motorization enabled created a pace of operations that German forces, designed for a different tempo, struggled to match. Decisions had to be made faster. Movements had to be executed more quickly. Information had to be processed and disseminated more rapidly. The entire rhythm of combat accelerated beyond what German doctrine anticipated. This temporal mismatch, as much as material inferiority, contributed to German difficulties in Normandy. The maintenance philosophy differences between American and German forces manifested in unexpected ways. Americans accepted that some vehicles would be lost to mechanical failure and planned accordingly. Germans tried to prevent mechanical failures through careful maintenance and operation. In theory, the German approach should have produced higher operational readiness rates. In practice, American operational readiness remained consistently higher because their system assumed failures and provided for immediate replacement. A German unit with 95% of vehicles operational but unable to replace the 5% down for maintenance proved less mobile than an American unit with 90% operational but with immediate replacement available for the 10% down. The evolution of Jeep modifications throughout the Normandy campaign illustrated American tactical learning. Initial Jeeps were standard production models. Within weeks, units were adding sandbags for improvised armor protection against small arms fire and shell fragments. Wire cutters were welded to bumpers to defeat German piano wire traps. Additional machine guns were mounted for enhanced firepower. Radios were installed for improved communications. Each modification addressed a specific tactical problem identified through combat experience. The modifications spread rapidly as successful innovations were copied by other units. This bottom-up innovation, enabled by the availability of welding equipment, spare parts, and institutional tolerance for modification, gave American forces an adaptive capability that German forces, with their emphasis on centralized control and standardization, lacked. The role of Jeeps in command and control deserves additional analysis. American commanders, from company level to division level, used Jeeps to visit subordinate units, assess situations personally, and make decisions based on direct observation. This command style, enabled by motorization, created a more responsive command system than German forces typically achieved. German commanders, often lacking adequate transport, relied more heavily on radio communications and staff reports. While radio provided faster communication, personal observation provided better situational awareness. The ability to drive to a problem area, assess the situation personally, make decisions on the spot, and communicate those decisions directly to subordinate commanders proved invaluable in the fluid combat of the Normandy campaign. The training infrastructure that supported American motorization operated on a scale that Germans found difficult to comprehend. Stateside training bases taught tens of thousands of soldiers to drive and maintain vehicles. Driver training was standardized across all facilities. Mechanics received systematic instruction on standard vehicles. The training system produced soldiers who arrived in combat theatres already qualified to operate and maintain the vehicles they would use. German training, constrained by fuel shortages and limited vehicle availability, often produced soldiers with theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience. This difference in training preparedness contributed to American operational effectiveness. The economic implications of American motorization extended beyond military considerations. The production of hundreds of thousands of military vehicles represented an enormous economic effort that employed hundreds of thousands of workers, consumed vast quantities of raw materials, and required coordination across multiple industries. Yet this production effort represented only a fraction of total American war production. The United States simultaneously produced aircraft, ships, weapons, ammunition, and countless other items in quantities that dwarfed Axis production. The Jeep, as impressive as its production numbers were, was merely one component of an industrial mobilization that completely outmatched anything Germany achieved. The captured Jeeps that German forces occasionally acquired provided opportunities for detailed examination and testing. German engineers studied the design, noting both its strengths and weaknesses. The strengths, simplicity, reliability, ease of maintenance, were acknowledged. The weaknesses, crude construction, limited refinement, modest performance, were noted. Yet the German engineers recognized that the weaknesses were irrelevant when production numbers reached 600,000 units. A crude but adequate vehicle produced in massive numbers proved more valuable than a sophisticated vehicle produced in limited quantities. This recognition influenced some German engineers' thinking about post-war design philosophy. The American logistics system supporting motorization extended far beyond vehicle production and delivery. Spare parts production had to match vehicle production. Tire manufacturing had to keep pace with consumption. Battery production had to provide replacements for worn batteries. Every component required its own production line, supply chain, and distribution system. The coordination required to ensure that all these elements worked in harmony represented an organizational achievement as impressive as the vehicle production itself. German logistics, struggling with shortages and disruptions, could not match this systematic approach to support. The social history of the Jeep in American culture adds another dimension to its military significance. The vehicle became iconic, representing American can-do spirit and practical innovation. Veterans returning from the war brought with them affection for the Jeep that influenced post-war vehicle preferences. The civilian Jeep vehicle introduced after the war capitalized on this affection and proved commercially successful. The military vehicle thus influenced civilian automotive culture, closing a loop that had begun with civilian mass production techniques being applied to military manufacturing. The contrast in how American and German forces treated captured vehicles illustrated fundamental differences in military culture. German forces eagerly utilized captured American vehicles, particularly Jeeps, which were prized for their reliability and mobility. Elaborate procedures were developed to camouflage captured Jeeps to prevent them from being mistaken for friendly vehicles. Fuel and parts were carefully preserved. The vehicles were maintained with care. American forces, when they captured German vehicles, often used them briefly, then abandoned them when they broke down, or when American vehicles became available. The German vehicles were interesting, but unnecessary. This difference in attitude toward captured equipment reflected the broader difference in material circumstances between the two sides. The final assessment of American motorization's impact on the Normandy campaign must acknowledge both its direct military effects and its broader strategic implications. Directly, motorization gave American forces tactical and operational mobility that German forces could not match. This mobility enabled rapid advances, flexible response to German actions, and sustained offensive operations that eventually broke German resistance. Strategically, American motorization demonstrated that the United States had successfully harnessed industrial production for military purposes at a scale that made Allied victory inevitable. The Jeep was both a weapon in its own right and a symbol of the industrial might that produced it, and both aspects contributed to Allied success in Normandy and beyond.